Welcome to a story that will shake you to your core. What happens when those who hold absolute power discover that some debts can never be paid? Tonight, we dive into a tale of greed, humanity, and the night everything changed forever. This is not just a story, it's a journey through the darkest chapters of human history and the light that emerged from the shadows. Subscribe now for more incredible historical stories that will leave you speechless. The humid August air of 1859 clung to Blackwood Plantation like a suffocating shroud, thick with the promise of violence that had always permeated the Louisiana bayou. Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks swayed without wind, and the cicadas' chorus seemed muted, as if nature itself held its breath for what was to come. The very air seemed to whisper of secrets buried in the rich, dark soil, secrets watered with blood and tears for over 3 generations. Inside the Grand Manor's study, a room that had witnessed countless nights of moral decay, 4 men sat around a mahogany table that gleamed like polished bone in the lamplight. The table itself was a monument to cruelty, carved from trees that had once shaded the graves of indigenous peoples, polished with oils mixed by enslaved hands, and stained with the tears of families torn apart by the very men who now used it for their twisted entertainment. Master Edmund Blackwood, 57 years old and owner of the plantation that bore his cursed name, shuffled his cards with practiced ease. His weathered hands, adorned with gold rings torn from the fingers of dead slaves, moved with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. Each ring told a story of brutality. The ruby from a woman who had died protecting her children, the emerald from a man who had dared to look him in the eye. His face, once handsome, had been twisted by decades of cruelty into something that barely resembled humanity. Across from him sat Colonel Harrison Whitmore, whose military bearing couldn't mask the cruelty that lurked behind his steel-gray eyes. At 62, Whitmore had served in the Mexican-American War, where he had learned that human life was the cheapest commodity of all. His uniform, still pressed despite the late hour, bore medals that represented not honor, but the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in his way. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw was a reminder of the slave rebellion he had crushed with such brutality that even his fellow officers had been sickened. "Gentlemen," Blackwood announced, his voice cutting through the thick air like a blade through flesh, "tonight we play for more than mere coins. Tonight we play for the very souls that make our fortunes possible." To his right, Judge Cornelius Ashford adjusted his spectacles with trembling fingers, his pale face gleaming with perspiration that had nothing to do with the heat. At 54, Ashford had perverted justice for so long that he had forgotten what it looked like. His court had become a marketplace where freedom was bought and sold, where free blacks were declared slaves on forged documents, and where the law served only those who could afford to buy it. The gavel that sat in his study at home was stained with the blood of innocents, metaphorically speaking, though some whispered it was literal as well. The 4th player, plantation owner Marcus Thornfield, leaned back in his leather chair with the casual arrogance of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. At 49, he was the youngest of the group, but perhaps the most vicious. His plantation, Thornfield Manor, was known throughout the region as a place where slaves went to die. He had perfected the art of breaking human spirits, of reducing proud men and women to cowering animals. His smile, which played constantly at the corners of his mouth, was the last thing many slaves ever saw. Behind them, like silent sentinels bearing witness to decades of atrocity, stood 3 enslaved women whose very presence told the story of systematic dehumanization that had defined the American South for generations. Sarah, barely 22 but aged beyond her years by suffering, kept her eyes downcast while her hands trembled slightly, Born on the plantation, she had never known freedom, had never tasted the sweet air of liberty that others took for granted. Her mother had been sold when Sarah was 10, torn from her daughter's arms, while Sarah screamed and begged. The memory of that day had carved itself into her soul like a brand, and she carried it with her every moment of every day. Her back bore the scars of countless whippings, each one a reminder that her body was not her own, that her pain was entertainment for men like those seated before her. Beside her stood Ruth, a woman of 40, whose back bore the scars of countless lashings, each one a testament to her refusal to be completely broken. Ruth had been born free in Philadelphia, the daughter of a seamstress and a blacksmith. She had learned to read and write, had dreamed of becoming a teacher, but at the age of 15 she had been kidnapped by slave catchers and sold into bondage. For 25 years she had endured horrors that would have destroyed lesser souls, but her spirit remained unbroken. Behind her stoic expression lay a mind that had been planning, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back at the system that had stolen her life. The third woman, young Mercy, no more than 18, clutched a silver tray so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She was the daughter of a woman who had been raped by Thornfield himself, a living reminder of the sexual violence that was as much a part of slavery as the cotton fields. Mercy had grown up knowing that her very existence was a crime in the eyes of the law, that she was considered property despite the white blood that flowed through her veins. Her light skin had made her a target for even more vicious treatment, as she was seen as a constant reminder of the hypocrisy that lay at the heart of the slave system. "The stakes tonight," Whitmore declared, placing a deed on the table with the casual indifference of a man discarding trash, "include my northern tobacco fields and the 20 souls who work them." The word souls dripped from his lips like poison. These were not souls to him, they were livestock, property to be bought, sold, traded, and discarded at will. Each of those 20 people had names, families, dreams, and fears, but to Whitmore they were nothing more than entries in a ledger book. The women's breathing became shallow, but they dared not move. They had learned long ago that their lives were nothing more than poker chips in the hands of these men, that their value was determined not by their humanity, but by their ability to generate profit. They had seen families destroyed by games like this, had watched children torn from their mothers' arms because of a bad hand of cards. Ashford nodded approvingly, his judicial robes seeming to mock the very concept of justice. "Excellent. I raise, with my cotton mill and the 15 workers who operate it." His voice carried the same casual tone one might use when discussing the weather, as if the lives of 15 human beings were no more significant than the cotton they processed. Those 15 workers included children as young as 8, their small fingers perfect for reaching into the dangerous machinery that claimed limbs and lives with regularity. Ashford had bought them specifically for this purpose, knowing that their size made them valuable and their youth made them expendable. Thornfield laughed, a sound devoid of warmth that seemed to echo from the depths of hell itself. "How delightfully barbaric we've become. Very well, I'll add my sugar refinery and the dozen hands who run it." The sugar refinery was a death sentence disguised as employment. The work was so dangerous, the conditions so brutal, that the average life expectancy of a worker was less than 7 years. Thornfield had calculated this precisely. It was more profitable to work slaves to death and buy new ones than to provide adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Blackwood's eyes gleamed in the lamplight like those of a predator spotting wounded prey. "And I," he said slowly, savoring each word like fine wine, "wager this very plantation, its 3,000 acres, and every soul upon it." The number was staggering. Over 300 human beings, representing generations of families who had been born, lived, and died in bondage. Among them were skilled craftsmen whose talents had built the very mansion in which this obscene game was taking place. Field hands whose labor had generated the wealth that allowed these men to treat human lives as gambling stakes. House servants who had raised the children of their masters while being forbidden to care for their own. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the night sounds outside seemed to cease, as if the very universe was holding its breath at the magnitude of the evil being contemplated. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized that her own fate, along with that of everyone she had ever known or loved, now depended on the turn of a card. Ruth's jaw clenched imperceptibly as decades of suppressed rage threatened to boil over. Mercy's grip on the tray tightened further, the silver cutting into her palms as she fought to maintain her composure. "Edmund," Whitmore whispered, his voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock that stood like a sentinel in the corner, counting down the moments until judgment. "You're wagering everything." "Indeed I am," Blackwood replied, dealing the cards with theatrical flair that would have been comical if the stakes weren't so horrifically real. "But I've never lost a game that mattered, and I don't intend to start tonight. Besides, what is life without risk? What is power without the willingness to wager it all?" His confidence was born of a lifetime of victories built on the suffering of others. He had inherited the plantation from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Blackwoods had ruled over this land like feudal lords, treating their slaves not as human beings, but as a renewable resource to be exploited until exhaustion and then replaced. As the cards were distributed, none of the men noticed the subtle exchange of glances between the 3 women. Years of silent communication had taught them to speak without words, to plan without sound. They had developed their own language of survival, a complex system of gestures and expressions that allowed them to coordinate resistance activities under the very noses of their oppressors. Tonight, something felt different, electric, dangerous, inevitable. The air itself seemed charged with the promise of change, as if the very foundations of the world were shifting beneath their feet. Ruth had felt it building for weeks, a sense that the time for passive resistance was coming to an end, that the moment for action was finally at hand. The first hand began, and with it, the fate of hundreds of lives hung in the balance. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an army of the damned, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like the voice of judgment itself. The wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and causing the flames in the oil lamps to dance wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls that seemed to writhe and twist like tortured souls. In the slave quarters, children who should have been sleeping peacefully were instead lying awake, sensing the tension that permeated the very air they breathed. Mothers held their babies closer, fathers stared at the ceiling and wondered if tomorrow would bring separation from their families. And the elderly whispered prayers to a God who seemed to have forgotten their suffering. But in the study of the big house, 4 men continued their game, oblivious to the storm that was brewing both outside their windows and within the hearts of those they had oppressed for so long. They were about to learn that some debts can never be paid, that some games have consequences that extend far beyond the table, and that the house always wins. But sometimes the house belongs to someone else entirely. The game progressed with methodical cruelty that would have made the devil himself proud. Each hand dealt brought new horrors to light as the men casually discussed human beings as if they were livestock at auction, their voices growing louder and more animated as the whiskey flowed and their inhibitions dissolved like sugar in rain. "That young buck, Samuel," Thornfield mused, studying his cards with the same attention a scholar might give to ancient texts. "He's worth at least 3 field hands, strong as an ox, that one, and smart enough to be dangerous if we're not careful." Samuel was 19 years old, born on the plantation and raised to believe that his strength was his only value. He had watched his father die from exhaustion in the fields, had seen his sister sold away when she was barely 14, and had learned to channel his rage into the back-breaking labor that kept him alive. What Thornfield didn't know was that Samuel could read, taught in secret by Ruth during stolen moments in the dead of night, and that he had been corresponding with abolitionists in the North, planning an escape route that would take him and dozens of others to freedom. Whitmore nodded approvingly, adding chips to the pot with the casual indifference of a man who had never known want. "I've had my eye on your seamstress, Ruth, there." He gestured carelessly toward the woman standing behind them, as if she were a piece of furniture he was considering purchasing. "Heard she can mend anything, even the finest silk. Could be useful for my wife's wardrobe." Ruth's face remained impassive, but her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the nails cutting into her palms as she fought to maintain control. She had spent countless nights mending the very clothes these men tore in their drunken rages, had sewn the garments they wore while deciding her fate and the fate of her people. Her skill with needle and thread was legendary throughout the region. But what they didn't know was that she had been using that same skill to create hidden pockets in clothing, secret compartments where messages could be passed between plantations, where maps and money could be hidden for those brave enough to run for freedom. "Ruth is indeed skilled," Blackwood agreed, not bothering to look at the woman in question, as if acknowledging her humanity might somehow diminish his own power. "But she's getting old, past her prime for other purposes." The crude laughter that followed made Sarah's stomach turn, bile rising in her throat as she was forced to listen to these monsters discuss the sexual exploitation of women as casually as they might discuss the weather. She remembered her own mother, beautiful and proud, who had been subjected to the same degradation before being sold away. She remembered the tears that fell silently in the slave quarters that night, the way the other women had held her and whispered words of comfort that felt hollow in the face of such overwhelming cruelty. As midnight approached and the storm outside intensified, the stakes had grown astronomical. Entire families were being wagered, separated and reunited based on the turn of a card, their lives reduced to nothing more than entries in a ledger book. The men's faces grew flushed with alcohol and excitement, their voices louder, their gestures more animated as they lost themselves in the intoxicating rush of absolute power over other human beings. "I'll see your 20 field hands," Ashford declared, his usual judicial composure cracking like ice under pressure, revealing the monster that lurked beneath the veneer of respectability, "and raise you the blacksmith and his 2 sons." The blacksmith was a man named Moses, 60 years old and respected throughout the slave community for his wisdom and skill. His 2 sons, David and Solomon, were in their 20s and had inherited their father's talent for working metal. Together, they had created not just horseshoes and farming implements, but also the tools that would be used in the coming rebellion. Weapons disguised as everyday objects, keys that could open any lock, and devices that could cut through the heaviest chains. "The blacksmith?" Whitmore protested, his military mind recognizing the strategic value of skilled craftsmen. "That man's worth his weight in gold. His work is better than anything you can find in New Orleans." "Precisely why he's perfect for this wager," Ashford replied coldly, his pale eyes glittering with malice. "High risk, high reward. Besides, I have it on good authority that he's been teaching his sons to read. Can't have that kind of dangerous thinking spreading through the quarters." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Teaching slaves to read was illegal throughout the South, punishable by death for both teacher and student. But Moses had been carefully instructing not just his sons, but dozens of other slaves, using the Bible as a textbook and the forge as a classroom. The ability to read had become a weapon more powerful than any sword, a tool that could break the chains of mental bondage that were often stronger than the physical ones. Behind them, Mercy had begun to sway slightly, the weight of witnessing such casual cruelty becoming almost unbearable. The sight of her friends and family being treated as mere property, their lives reduced to poker chips in the hands of these demons, was threatening to break her spirit entirely. Sarah noticed her distress and gently steadied her with a subtle touch, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes about the bonds that had formed between the enslaved community. It was then that Ruth made her move, a decision that had been building for 25 years of bondage and brutality. Under the pretense of refilling their glasses, she approached the table with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to move like a shadow, invisible until the moment she chose to strike. As she leaned over to pour Blackwood's whiskey, the amber liquid catching the lamplight like liquid fire, she whispered something so quietly that only Sarah and Mercy could hear. "The lamp. When I give the signal, be ready." The other women's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, but they gave no other sign of having heard. Years of oppression had taught them the art of invisible communication, the ability to coordinate resistance activities under the very noses of their oppressors. They had been preparing for this moment for months, gathering intelligence, making contacts, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike back at the system that had stolen their lives and the lives of their ancestors. "Gentlemen," Blackwood announced, his voice slurred with drink, but still carrying the authority of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, "I propose we make this truly interesting. One final hand, winner takes all." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if the very elements were holding their breath at the magnitude of the evil being contemplated. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost solid with tension and the weight of impending doom. "All?" Thornfield repeated, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the spell that had fallen over the room. "Everything on this table, every deed, every soul, every acre of land. One hand of poker to determine who becomes the most powerful man in 3 counties, perhaps in all of Louisiana." The magnitude of what they were proposing was staggering. Hundreds of lives, thousands of acres, fortunes built over generations, all riding on 5 cards dealt by hands stained with the blood of innocents. It was the ultimate expression of the arrogance and cruelty that had defined the plantation system. The belief that human beings could be owned, traded, and discarded at will. The men looked at each other, greed and fear warring in their expressions, like angels and demons battling for their souls. The magnitude of what they were proposing was beyond anything they had ever attempted. A gamble that would make one of them the most powerful man in the region and reduce the others to relative poverty. "Think of it," Blackwood continued, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "Over 1,000 souls, tens of thousands of acres, enough wealth to buy and sell entire cities. The winner of this hand will have the power of life and death over more people than some kings." "And the losers?" Whitmore asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The losers will learn what it means to fall from grace," Blackwood replied with a smile that would have made Satan himself proud. "They will discover that fortune's wheel turns for everyone, even those who believe themselves above its reach." "Agreed," Whitmore said finally, his military training overriding his caution. The prospect of such absolute power was too tempting to resist, even for a man who had seen the horrors of war. "Agreed," echoed Ashford and Thornfield in unison, their voices carrying the weight of a pact made with the devil himself. As Blackwood began to shuffle the deck for the final hand, his movements taking on an almost ritualistic quality, Ruth caught Sarah's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. The signal had been given, and the wheels of justice, so long delayed, were finally beginning to turn. The fate of Blackwood Plantation, and everyone on it, now rested in the hands of 4 men, too drunk on power to notice the storm brewing both outside their windows and within the very walls of their fortress of cruelty. They were about to learn that some games have rules that extend beyond the table, that some debts can never be paid with money, and that the house always wins. But sometimes the house belongs to someone else entirely. Outside, the storm was building to a crescendo, and in the slave quarters 300 souls lay awake, sensing that this night would be different from all the others. Change was coming to Blackwood Plantation, carried on the wings of the storm, and in the hearts of those who had suffered too long in silence. The cards were dealt with ceremonial gravity, each one falling onto the mahogany table like a drop of blood onto an altar of sacrifice. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence that had fallen over the room, broken only by the increasingly violent storm outside, and the labored breathing of men whose souls had been sold long ago for the price of absolute power. Each man picked up his hand, as if holding the keys to an empire, which in many ways they were. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife, heavy enough to crush the spirit of anyone who wasn't already dead inside. The very air seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy, as if the room itself had become a conduit for all the evil that had been perpetrated within its walls over the decades. Blackwood examined his cards with the practiced eye of a man who had been gambling with human lives for over 30 years. A pair of kings, the King of Hearts and the King of Spades. Not terrible, but not the hand he'd hoped for. The irony of holding the kings while gambling away the lives of his subjects was lost on him entirely, his capacity for self-reflection having been burned away by years of unchecked cruelty. Across from him, Whitmore's poker face revealed nothing, though a slight twitch in his left eye, a nervous habit he'd developed during the war, suggested that his hand was either very good or very bad. His military training had taught him to hide his emotions, but 20 years of civilian life had softened his discipline just enough to create tiny cracks in his facade. Ashford's breathing had become shallow and rapid, his pale face glistening with perspiration that had nothing to do with the humid Louisiana air. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his cards, and his usual judicial composure was cracking like a dam under pressure. The weight of what they were doing, gambling away the lives of over 1,000 human beings, was finally beginning to penetrate even his corrupted conscience. Thornfield drummed his fingers silently on the table's edge, a habit that had driven his wife to distraction during their brief, loveless marriage before she had died under mysterious circumstances. His face wore its usual expression of cruel amusement, but there was something different in his eyes tonight, a hunger that went beyond mere greed, a desire for power that bordered on the supernatural. "Before we begin," Blackwood said, reaching for his glass with hands that bore the scars of violence inflicted on those who could not fight back, "a toast to the victor. Whoever he may be, may he rule his new empire with the iron fist it deserves." As the 4 men raised their glasses, the amber whiskey catching the lamplight like liquid fire, Ruth moved with the practiced stealth of someone who had spent 25 years learning to be invisible. She had spent years serving these men, learning their habits, their blind spots, their weaknesses. She knew exactly when they would be distracted, exactly how to move without drawing attention, exactly how to strike when the moment was right. The moment their glasses touched their lips, Ruth's elbow accidentally knocked against the oil lamp on the side table. The lamp teetered precariously, its flame dancing wildly like a soul in torment, casting erratic shadows across the room that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. "Careful, you clumsy," Blackwood began, his words slurred with drink and rage. But his sentence was cut short as the lamp crashed to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. The oil spread quickly across the expensive Persian rug, a rug woven by enslaved hands in a distant land and purchased with money earned from the blood and sweat of American slaves. Flames began to lick at the expensive fabric, the fire seeming to dance with unholy glee as it consumed the symbol of wealth built on human suffering. In the sudden chaos, as the men scrambled to their feet like the cowards they truly were, shouting orders and curses that would have made a sailor blush, none of them noticed Sarah slip the cards from Blackwood's hand with the skill of a professional pickpocket. Years of serving these men had taught her to move like smoke, to be present when needed and invisible when convenient. With movements so quick and subtle they seemed almost supernatural, she replaced Blackwood's cards with others from her apron pocket, cards that Ruth had prepared weeks ago, marked with tiny pinpricks that were invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The switch was so smooth, so perfectly executed, that even a professional gambler would have missed it. "Put it out! Put it out!" Ashford screamed, his judicial composure completely shattered, revealing the frightened child that lurked beneath his robes of office. His voice cracked with terror, not of the fire itself, but of what it might represent, the beginning of the end of their world of absolute power. Mercy rushed forward with a pitcher of water that had been sitting on a nearby table, dousing the flames before they could spread further and consume the evidence of what was about to transpire. The acrid smell of smoke filled the room, mixing with the scent of fear, sweat, and whiskey to create an atmosphere that seemed to come straight from the depths of hell. When the chaos settled and the men found themselves standing around a table with scattered cards and overturned glasses, their faces were flushed with adrenaline and alcohol, their expensive clothes disheveled, their carefully maintained facades of respectability cracked and crumbling. "The game," Thornfield said breathlessly, his usual composure shaken but not broken. "We must finish the game. Too much is at stake to stop now." "Of course," Blackwood agreed, though his hands shook slightly as he gathered the cards, his confidence shaken by the near disaster. "Where were we?" "Ah, yes. The final hand. The hand that will determine the fate of empires." "You were about to show your hand," Whitmore reminded him, his military bearing returning as he fought to regain control of the situation. Blackwood looked down at his cards, confident in his pair of kings, certain that fortune would favor him as it always had. But as he spread them on the table with a flourish, his face went white as fresh cotton, his eyes widening in disbelief and horror. Instead of the kings he remembered holding, he now possessed a 2 of clubs, a 4 of diamonds, a 7 of hearts, a 9 of spades, and a jack of clubs, all of different suits, the worst possible hand in poker. It was as if the cards themselves had betrayed him, as if the very universe was conspiring against him. "What? How?" he stammered, looking at the cards as if they had personally insulted his mother, his voice barely a whisper as the magnitude of his situation began to sink in. One by one, the other men revealed their hands, each revelation adding another layer to the unfolding drama. Whitmore had a pair of 3s, low, but still better than Blackwood's nothing. Ashford held 2 pairs, 8s and 5s, a respectable hand that would have won most games. But Thornfield, with a triumphant grin that split his face like a wound, laid down a full house, 3 10s and 2 queens. The cards seemed to gleam in the lamplight as if they were made of gold, and his laughter echoed through the room like the sound of chains breaking. "Impossible," Blackwood whispered, his face ashen, his entire world crumbling around him like a house built on sand. I was certain I had." "You had nothing," Thornfield laughed, his voice echoing through the smoke-tinged room with the sound of absolute victory. "And now, my dear Edmund, everything you own belongs to me. Your plantation, your slaves, your fortune, your very legacy, all mine. The magnitude of what had just occurred began to sink in like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward to encompass not just the men in the room, but every soul on the plantation. Blackwood had lost everything: his plantation, his home, his fortune, and most importantly, his power over the 300 souls who called Blackwood Plantation home. But as Thornfield reached for the deeds and documents on the table, his hands trembling with excitement and greed, something unexpected happened, something that would change the course of history itself. Ruth stepped forward from the shadows, where she had stood for so many years, her voice clear and strong for the first time in 25 years of enforced servitude. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of generations of suffering, the power of truth that had been suppressed for too long. "No," she said simply, the single word falling into the silence like a thunderclap. The 4 men turned to stare at her, shocked into silence by the audacity of a slave speaking without permission, their faces registering disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear. In their world, slaves were property that spoke only when spoken to, that existed only to serve their master's whims. "What did you say?" Thornfield demanded, his face flushing red with rage, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol he always carried. "How dare you speak without permission, you worthless—" "I said no," Ruth repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. 25 years of suppressed fury finally finding its voice. "This game is over, but not the way you think." Behind her, Sarah and Mercy stepped forward, flanking her on either side like soldiers taking their positions for battle. For the first time in their lives, they stood not as property, but as human beings claiming their dignity, their humanity, their right to exist as something more than livestock. "You forget," Ruth continued, her eyes blazing with decades of suppressed fury, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her power, "that we have eyes and ears. We see everything, hear everything, remember everything, and we know things that would destroy you all if they ever came to light." The men exchanged glances, their confidence beginning to crack like ice in spring. They had always assumed that their slaves were too ignorant, too broken, too afraid to pose any real threat. They had never considered that their victims might be watching, learning, planning. "We know about the Underground Railroad station in the old oak tree," Ruth continued, her voice steady and sure. "We know about the federal marshals who've been asking questions in town. We know about the letters you've been hiding, Judge Ashford, the ones that prove you've been selling free papers to slave catchers, condemning free blacks to slavery for profit." Ashford's face went white as bleached bone, his hands trembling as the weight of his crimes crashed down upon him. You can't prove anything," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Can't we?" Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite her racing heart, despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. 20 years of cleaning your offices, washing your clothes, emptying your trash. You'd be amazed what people throw away when they think no one's watching, when they believe their slaves are too stupid to read. The revelation that she could read hit the men like a physical blow. Literacy among slaves was not just illegal, it was their greatest fear, the one thing that could truly threaten their power. A slave who could read, could forge papers, could communicate with the outside world, could spread dangerous ideas of freedom and equality. "And we know about the children," Mercy added, her young voice trembling but determined, her words carrying the weight of unspeakable horrors. "The ones who disappear from the quarters, the ones who are sold to the brothels in New Orleans, the ones who die in your sugar mills and are buried in unmarked graves." The storm outside had intensified, and lightning illuminated the windows with stark, white light that seemed to come from another world entirely. In that moment, the balance of power in the room shifted irrevocably, like a great wheel turning after centuries of being stuck in place. Thunder crashed overhead like the voice of God himself, and in the slave quarters, 300 souls felt something they had never felt before: hope. The masters had gambled everything and lost, but their losses were far greater than they could have ever imagined. The game was about to change in ways that none of them could have predicted, and the house was about to discover that it had been built on foundations of sand all along. The silence that followed Mercy's words was deafening, broken only by the sound of rain lashing against the windows like the tears of every soul who had ever suffered within these walls. The 4 men who had entered the evening as masters of their domain now found themselves facing a reality they had never imagined. Their victims had become their judges, and the court was finally in session. "This is preposterous," Whitmore blustered, his military bearing cracking under pressure like armor struck by cannon fire. "You're slaves. You have no rights, no legal standing, no rights," Ruth interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade through silk. "Tell that to the federal agents who've been investigating the illegal slave trade in this county for the past 6 months. Tell that to the abolitionists who've been documenting every crime committed on these plantations, every family destroyed, every life lost." From beneath her apron, she produced a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting that represented years of meticulous record-keeping. The sight of it made the men recoil, as if she had pulled out a venomous snake, their faces registering the dawning realization that their crimes had been documented by the very people they had victimized. 20 years of records, gentlemen," Ruth continued, her voice steady and sure. "Every beating, every family separated, every accident that befell those who dared to resist. Names, dates, witnesses. The federal marshals will be very interested in reading about Judge Ashford's practice of selling free blacks into slavery, about Colonel Whitmore's use of military tactics to suppress slave rebellions, about Mr. Thornfield's sugar mills, where the average life expectancy is less than 5 years. The journal represented more than just evidence. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, people would find ways to resist, to remember, to bear witness to injustice. Ruth had risked her life every time she made an entry, hiding the journal in places where it would never be found, writing by candlelight in the dead of night when the overseers were drunk or asleep. Mercy stepped forward, her young voice trembling but determined, her words carrying the weight of a generation that had known nothing but suffering. "My brother didn't die of fever like you told everyone, Mr. Thornfield. We saw you beat him to death for trying to learn to read. He was only 12 years old." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mercy's brother, Thomas, had been caught with a piece of paper on which he had been practicing writing his name. For this crime, the crime of trying to become literate, Thornfield had beaten him so severely that he died 3 days later, his small body unable to withstand the brutality inflicted upon it. "And my husband," Sarah added, tears streaming down her face as she spoke of the love she had lost, "didn't run away like you told the authorities. Judge Ashford had him killed when he threatened to expose the illegal sales of free blacks back into slavery. We found his body in the swamp, but we were too afraid to speak up, until now." Sarah's husband, Joshua, had been born free in Virginia, but had been kidnapped and sold into slavery when he was 25. He had spent 5 years trying to prove his free status, gathering documents and witnesses, until he finally had enough evidence to expose the entire operation. The night before he was supposed to meet with federal authorities, he disappeared. His body was found a week later, but the official cause of death was listed as drowning. The accusations continued to pour forth like water from a broken dam, each revelation adding another layer to the mountain of evidence that had been building for years. The 3 women spoke of horrors that would have been unimaginable to most people, but which were daily realities for those trapped in the hell of slavery. They spoke of children sold away from their mothers, of women raped by their masters, of men worked to death in the fields. They spoke of families torn apart by gambling debts, of free blacks kidnapped and sold into bondage, of slaves murdered for the crime of trying to learn to read. Each story was a dagger thrust into the hearts of the men who had perpetrated these crimes. Each revelation a nail in the coffin of the system they had built their fortunes upon. The accusations hung in the air like smoke from the extinguished lamp. Each revelation a nail in the coffin of the old order, a system built on cruelty and maintained through terror. Each word was a weapon more powerful than any gun, a truth more devastating than any physical blow. Blackwood, still reeling from his gambling losses and the magnitude of what was being revealed, found his voice through the haze of alcohol and shock. Even if what you're saying is true, you're still property. The law is changing, Ruth said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had studied the legal system from the inside, who had learned to read not just words, but the writing on the wall, and tonight it changes here. As if summoned by her words, the sound of horses' hooves thundered through the storm, cutting through the rain and wind like the approach of destiny itself. Lantern light flickered through the windows as riders approached the main house, their torches creating dancing shadows that seemed to herald the arrival of justice long delayed. The men at the table exchanged panicked glances, their faces registering the dawning realization that their world was about to come crashing down around them. They had always believed themselves to be above the law, protected by their wealth and status, insulated from consequences by the very system they had helped to create. "You see," Ruth continued, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth for the first time in 25 years, "while you were gambling away lives like poker chips, we were making our own wagers. We bet that justice would come to Blackwood Plantation. We bet that the Underground Railroad conductors would arrive tonight as planned. And we bet that the evidence we've gathered would be enough to bring down not just one plantation, but an entire network of corruption that stretches from here to Washington." The front door burst open with a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, and federal marshals streamed into the mansion like an avenging army. Their badges gleamed in the lamplight, symbols of a federal authority that superseded local corruption, representatives of a government that was finally beginning to take seriously the crimes being committed in its name. Behind them came men and women Ruth recognized, conductors on the Underground Railroad, abolitionists who had risked their lives to help slaves escape to freedom, and most surprisingly, several free blacks who had once been enslaved on neighboring plantations and had returned to bear witness against their former masters. "Edmund Blackwood," the lead marshal announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "You're under arrest for violations of federal law regarding the treatment of enslaved persons, conspiracy to sell free blacks into slavery, and accessory to murder." The charges were read like an indictment against the entire system of slavery itself. One by one, the other men were also placed under arrest, their hands bound with the same iron shackles they had used to bind others, their freedom stripped away as casually as they had stripped away the freedom of countless others. The charges were extensive and damning: murder, conspiracy, illegal slave trading, corruption of federal officials, kidnapping, rape, and crimes against humanity that would have been unthinkable in any civilized society. Each charge represented not just a legal violation, but a moral crime that had stained the soul of the nation itself. As the marshals led the four men away in chains, Thornfield turned back to Ruth with hatred burning in his eyes like the fires of hell itself. "You think this changes anything? You think you're free now? You're still nothing but—" His words were cut short as one of the marshals, a tall black man with scars on his wrists that told his own story of bondage and liberation, stepped between them. The marshal's presence was like a physical manifestation of justice, a living symbol of the fact that the oppressed could become the liberators. "No," the marshal said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked the path from slavery to freedom and had returned to help others make the same journey. "They're free. And you, sir, are the one who is now property of the federal prison system, where you'll spend the rest of your miserable life paying for your crimes." The irony was not lost on anyone present. The men who had spent their lives treating other human beings as property were now themselves reduced to the status of prisoners, their freedom forfeit, their futures determined by others. The wheel of fortune had turned completely, and those who had been on top were now crushed beneath its weight. As dawn broke over Blackwood Plantation, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to herald a new age, a transformation began that would echo through history. The 300 souls who had awakened as slaves went to sleep as free men and women, their chains broken not by violence, but by the power of truth and the courage of those who had refused to be silenced. The Underground Railroad conductors worked through the night, helping to organize the transition and ensuring that those who wished to leave could do so safely. Some chose to head north to cities where they could disappear into free black communities, while others decided to stay and work the land as free laborers, finally able to profit from their own labor. Ruth stood on the front porch of the big house as the sun climbed higher, watching the dawn of a new day break over fields that would no longer know the crack of the overseer's whip. In her hands, she held the deed to the plantation, abandoned property that the federal government had decided to grant to the people who had worked it for generations, without compensation. The transformation was not just legal but spiritual. The very air seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from the land itself. Children who had never known freedom ran through the fields, their laughter echoing across acres that had known only suffering for so long. Sarah joined her on the porch, carrying a cup of real coffee, not the chicory substitute they'd been given as slaves, but genuine coffee purchased with money they had earned through their own labor. The simple act of drinking coffee as free women was a revolution in itself, a small but profound symbol of their transformation from property to people. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with wonder at the possibilities that lay before them. Ruth smiled, her face peaceful for the first time in decades, the lines of suffering beginning to soften as hope took root in her heart. "Now we build something new, something better, something that honors the memory of all those who didn't live to see this day." The task ahead was enormous. They would need to establish schools, create a functioning economy, build a community that could sustain itself without the brutal hierarchy of slavery. But for the first time in their lives, they had the freedom to try, the right to fail, and the power to determine their own destiny. Behind them, Mercy emerged from the house carrying a small bag packed with her few possessions. At 18, she was young enough to dream of possibilities that had been unimaginable just hours before. "I'm going north," she announced, her voice filled with determination. "To school. To learn everything they never wanted us to know. To become a teacher, a doctor, maybe even a lawyer." The idea of a former slave becoming a lawyer would have been laughable to the men who had been arrested just hours before. But in this new world that was being born, anything seemed possible. Education, which had been forbidden under penalty of death, was now not just allowed, but encouraged. "And you'll come back?" Sarah asked, understanding that the young woman's journey was necessary, but hoping that the bonds forged in suffering would not be broken by freedom. "I'll come back," Mercy promised, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "To teach others, to make sure this story is never forgotten, to ensure that what happened here never happens again." As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to herald a new age, the three women stood together, no longer as property, but as the architects of a new beginning. They represented not just their own liberation, but the liberation of an entire people who had been held in bondage for centuries. The plantation masters had gambled everything and lost, but their loss had become freedom's greatest victory. The cruel table where lives had been wagered like coins now sat empty and abandoned, a monument to the night when justice finally came to call. In the slave quarters, now simply called the community, children who had gone to sleep in bondage woke up free, ready to write their own stories in a world where their humanity could no longer be denied. The game was over, and for the first time in the history of Blackwood Plantation, the right side had won. The transformation of Blackwood Plantation became a symbol of what was possible when justice finally prevailed over oppression. Word of what had happened spread throughout the South, inspiring other enslaved communities and striking fear into the hearts of those who profited from human bondage. The federal investigation that followed uncovered a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, leading to dozens of arrests and the liberation of thousands of enslaved people. The evidence gathered by Ruth and others like her became the foundation for legal cases that would help bring about the end of slavery itself. But perhaps most importantly, the story of that night became a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most brutal oppression. It proved that no system of control, no matter how complete it might seem, could ultimately suppress the desire for freedom that burns in every human heart. The cruel table had been overturned, the game had ended, and a new chapter in the long struggle for human dignity had begun. The plantation masters had learned too late that some debts can never be paid, that some games have consequences that extend far beyond the table, and that the house always wins, but sometimes the house belongs to someone else entirely. This story reminds us that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied. The courage of those who stood up against impossible odds changed not just their own fate, but the course of history itself. It shows us that even in the darkest times, when evil seems to have triumphed completely, the human spirit can find ways to resist, to hope, and ultimately to overcome. The transformation of Blackwood Plantation from a place of suffering to a beacon of freedom demonstrates that change is possible, that systems of oppression can be overthrown, and that those who seem powerless can become the agents of their own liberation. Subscribe for more powerful historical stories that illuminate the triumph of human dignity over oppression. Share this story to keep these important lessons alive and to honor the memory of all those who fought for freedom. What other untold stories of courage and resistance would you like to hear? The history books are full of tales waiting to be told, of heroes whose names have been forgotten but whose courage changed the world. Let us know in the comments below what stories you'd like us to explore next. Remember, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the stories of those who paid that price must never be forgotten. Their courage lights the way for all who come after, showing us that no matter how dark the night, dawn will always come for those who refuse to give up hope.